Greetings, this is Management 431. This is Chapter 6, which is the first chapter in the third module, and it deals with sourcing, which basically means how do we identify where we find recruits? So how do we figure out which sources we should use to identify and attract applicants to our company and to apply to our company and to fill our vacancies? In terms of the learning objectives for this chapter, obviously there's the same sets of general sets of learning objectives. We want to be able to describe the role of sourcing in the staffing process. And the goal here is figuring out why sourcing informs recruiting, why recruiting informs selection, and how selection helps us to make the hiring decision in the end. So honestly, the better the job we do with sourcing up front, the easier it is for us to make a hiring decision downstream. Number two, we want to be able to explain what makes one recruiting source more effective than the other. And this is the importance of metrics and understanding yield ratios and how we apply those metrics to each different recruiting source to figure out which recruiting source is the best. I know that I introduced this to those students who took Management 430, but it's really important that you understand this in 431 and be able to apply it. If you don't understand these yield statistics, this is going to be a problem. Number three, we want to be able to list alternative recruiting sources and match them with specific jobs. So ultimately, we need to figure out which recruiting sources are best for the job. Just because we have a pool of recruiting sources that we like to use doesn't mean that those recruiting sources are good for every single job we have in the company. There are certain types of positions that do well with one kind of source and certain kind of positions that do better with different kinds of sources. The next item, creating a sourcing plan. So like developing a recruiting plan or a sourcing plan or a selection plan, the sourcing plan is the beginning stage of your selection system, whatever that system is going to look like. We'll also talk about how to source non-traditional applicants and recognizing that, and also working on understanding how to think about geography and what you consider to be your labor market, right? If you're a small business, then your labor market is probably people who work close by. But if you are a larger or medium or larger size business, then your relevant labor market is much broader. So we'll think about how geography and geographic regions helps us with sourcing. Sourcing is defined as identifying and locating high potential recruits. And what we mean by high potential recruits are the people that we believe we have the greatest potential of actually being able to attract and hire to our business. And so we also want to think about sourcing as sources that we know will yield us the greatest amount of applicants that we can select from. And that's our goal as well. So we do sourcing both internally and externally. And we'll talk about the difference between the two. Sourcing internally, in some ways, is a little bit easier because we already have these employees in our organization and we have tools to be able to figure out which applicants have the right skill set that we're looking for, which ones may have transferable skills. We know from past histories and transition matrices, as we talked about in the previous module, about how people can transition between different areas. And so where might we likely find people transferring laterally from, or moving from a lower position to an upper position, being promoted up to, so we know what the sources are for different flows of employees in the company. Externally, we all have different routines that we like to do and tools that we like to use, and it's really easy for a recruiter to get into a rut and only use a particular source. But it really is important that as they use sources and on a regular basis, whether it's quarterly or semi-annually or annually, to go through and analyze your recruiting sources and whether or not they're yielding you the kinds of candidates that are worthwhile for you, because you might get stuck using somebody that might have been good 2 years ago but now are not yielding you good employees. So you might want to be looking at trends and making sure that you're still getting the yields that you want from your different recruiting sources. We already introduced this idea of active versus passive job seekers in a previous module. So we'll go into a little bit more detail now, particularly how it's relevant to the idea of sourcing. Active job seekers are people who need a job and are actively looking for information about job openings. And so these are the people that are actively on the job market. And there may be a whole host of reasons why people are active job seekers. We might have a really bad economy, so employers have laid a whole bunch of people off. So we have a glut or a surplus of people that are in the job market looking for work. Some people believe that active job seekers may not be the highest quality candidates, particularly if they're unemployed. They might not be the best worker. But that's not always true, because organizations don't always lay off based on performance. It could also be that a particular product is no longer viable in the market, and the people who are involved in selling that product or making that product, they did the best that they could, but the customers don't want the product anymore. So you decide to sell off that division or close that division down. Now you have a bunch of people who are unemployed. And it's not because they didn't do a good job producing the product, but the product is no longer desired. So again, these are things that we have to think about. We can't always assume that active job seekers are poor performers. Although, again, there are some assumptions that passive job seekers, by and large, may be of higher quality than the active job seekers are, or the semi-passive job seekers are. So it is important to recognize that in order to make sure you've got the full range of skill set available to you and the full range of potential from poor to the best employees, that you cannot just depend on active job seekers, that you actually want to be using and going after passive job seekers as well. Now, what is a semi-passive job seeker? And these are people who are interested in a new position, but they don't necessarily actively look. Like, they might every once in a while check out the job boards or check out the newspaper and ping the job just to see how viable they are in the market, or if it's a new opportunity that they might like. It's not that they're unhappy where they're at, but they're open to new opportunities and new ideas. And so semi-passive job seekers are also, good to look at as well. And again, it gives you the whole range. If you go from active to passive job seekers, it gives you a really good range. You've got a good range of people and their skill set that would be viable for your company. Just as an important note at the bottom, many high-quality candidates are passive job seekers, which is why oftentimes organizations use headhunters. Headhunters approach passive job seekers. You pay them to go after passive job seekers because they have a database of people. They know their skill set. They know what people can and can't do, and they will actively go out and seek those people and encourage them to come and apply for a job. So, passive job seekers typically are recruited through headhunters. That's one of the most popular ways to find them. I like this slide because it's a really sort of easy way for you to think about the different criteria on which to evaluate your recruiting sources. Are they faster or slower? Are they cheaper or more expensive? Do they get you a good fit with your company culture? Do they give you high quality people? Do they give you people who are less likely to leave your company? So you want to look at sort of the longevity, how long those people stay. Are they good at acquiring people that have past experience? Are they good at generating a large number of hires so that our hiring ratio is we don't have to make too many job offers in order to get the number of employees that we need? Are they good at generating good professionals? Lawyers, accountants, et cetera, et cetera. Are they better for hiring in non-core competency areas of the company? For example, secretarial staff, right? So do I want to go to, if we're an R&D kind of company, a research-based company, my research scientists are at my core, right? But can I find people who are staffers that are important no matter what, mailroom clerks and IT professionals and secretarial staff and administrators, where they don't have to know my industry, they simply know how to do secretarial work or administrative work and things like that. Some sources are better at finding diverse applicants. Some are better for finding people who aren't actively looking for a job. So here's what you should be thinking about is when you are sourcing your different people or organizations to provide you with recruits, think about all these criteria and how many of these are relevant to you and your company in that time. Some of these might be completely relevant, some of them are not. So keep this list. Keep that in mind so that as you are getting ready to go and recruit, you can be thinking about what's the most important thing for me in this particular position. It might be high quality people, or it might be making sure I got enough people, that I can hire from, because I'm always actively recruiting for entry level positions, for example. So there's all sorts of factors to consider, and this is just a really good list right here. In terms of the different types of recruiting sources, you've got resources that are internal to the company, as we've talked about, and we use different resources to help us to gain access to our internal resources that are very different from the types of tools and resources that we use to get our external candidates. So we have to have two sets. Typically, our internal recruiting sources will work with training and development for that, because training and development typically keeps track of the KSAs of our employees, the training sessions that they've gone through, the developmental opportunities that are available for them. They take care of the succession planning and those sorts of issues as well. So that is, that's what typically is involved in internal recruiting. External is all about the employment agencies or the newspapers or the online databases or headhunters and all sorts of things that are external to the company. This is table 6.1 in the textbook, and it shows you just a really lovely succinct list of your internal versus your external recruiting sources. And I think this is a really good resource for you to hold on to because it gives you a good sense of the types of organizations that will support you with either internal or external recruiting. And what I mean organization, I really just mean departments and resources and systems internally to the company when we're dealing with internal recruiting. For example, do you have a succession management plan where we know what skill set people have, what they need in order to be ready for promotion to the next level? And we talked about that in the forecasting planning, if you remember that from the last module. Talent inventories, again, your human resource information systems keep track of the KSAs that your employees have so that we can keep track of where they're at, what their abilities are, and what new training they've engaged in and what new certifications that they have so that we have a good inventory on that. Development plans, right? So we oftentimes will send our employees to leadership development plans to help, programs rather, to help them get ready so that we have a plan to develop people to be ready for promotions and promotional opportunities. We may also have an intranet in the company where we have an internal job posting system. So particularly if we tend to err, like Churns does, in internal hires first, we give deference to internal hires. We want to make sure we've got an internal system in place that gives our internal candidates an opportunity to apply for positions, and then we open up the job opportunities to the external market. But we want to have a really clear system that people know how to access, know regularly what new jobs are being posted. Do you have a system in place where you send blast emails out to everybody, or do you just leave it as a passive thing where there's only, people know where to find the link and they just go after it if they're interested? So, and that's all part of your sourcing plan, right? Are you going to proactively go after people, or are you going to reactively let them apply as openings come open? And always I would recommend being more proactive in that approach, but we can talk about that as we get into the material. And then lastly is referrals, right? You might ask one of your internal employees to recommend somebody. They become an internal source, right? For somebody else in the company, and they also can work for externally, right? So you can get somebody say, hey, do you know anybody who knows how to do X? This kind of software program, and they might say, yeah, my friend works at such and such a company and they're looking for a new job, they would be interested in this. So that transitions us to the right hand side of there where we talk about referrals, and there's a whole bunch of different kind of external sources. besides the employee referrals, it's in-house recruiters, advertisements, job fairs, just observing people and, walking down the hall, watching people do work and saying, I think you'd be really good for this position in my department. You might have a resume database where your employees have to update their curriculum vitae of their resume. It's in a database system, and then we can search internal resume databases. And as people send their resumes in, we keep them in a database also. So we've got a combination of internal candidates that we can access through that database, which might be our talent inventory. And then we've got an external database of resumes. We've got career sites that we can go to, like monsterjobs.com and things like that. I don't know if those are still popular anymore, but I know that they were big for a long time. Online job boards, search firms, headhunters, professional associations, like Society for Human Resource Management has regional associations, and if you want to hire an HR professional, that's a great place to network and get to know people. So if you want to look for a job in HR, you let people know in your local SHRM chapter that you're looking for work. There are state employment agencies, military transition services that help people who are leaving the military and going to civilian jobs. That's a really huge part of training and development and making sure people are ready with transferable skills from one context to another. Acquisitions and mergers are another way that you get employees. If you acquire or merge with another company, you will have a lot of excess employees. So when you're doing that merger, you need to develop a plan for how you're going to decide which employees you keep and which employees are going to leave and get laid off because they are redundant. You might, look at your competitors and see who's doing certain jobs in certain areas and reach out through headhunters to attract those people to come and work for you. Internet data mining is another way where we data mine people in the news to see who's done what in what areas and what skill sets, and actively see if we can locate them and attract them to come work for our company. Networking opportunities, going to social events where people get together is really important. Schools, college recruiting, high school recruiting, depending on the job, previous employees, people who have been laid off, people who left and went someplace else, see if you can attract them and have them come back. You might have to think more globally and bring in non-U.S. citizens. Now, there are challenges to that because we have to make sure people are eligible to work in the U.S., that we can get visas for them to be able to do so, but that's why you have immigration attorneys to help you with those decisions. Walk-in candidates, that's the cheapest way to get people, but it's not always the highest quality. So depending on the kind of position you're recruiting for, clearly you don't want to have a walk-in candidate for a CEO, right? Sounds ridiculous. But you might have a walk-in candidate for somebody to come work at McDonald's or Walmart or, the local pizza joint, those kinds of jobs. And then, there are all different kinds of creative sourcing opportunities, which we can talk about. Again, very quickly, internet data mining, basically we can do some Boolean searches to look online to find people with certain skill sets or people who show up in the news pretty regularly. We can do Boolean searches through LinkedIn and other tools. But basically the goal is that we want to search actively for people with either a particular skill set or a transferable skill set and look online to find where we can locate these individuals. So here's a couple of different ways you can do internet data mining. Number one, you could do flipping or flip searching, which is identify people who link to a website. So, you could link to a company, maybe that, like Microsoft, where you could link to their stuff, see who's searching on their website, and see if they've got resumes online, those kinds of things. Web crawlers, sites that usually continually search for people with desirable talents and they sell access to recruiters. So in essence, what happens is the web crawler looks at your internet patterns and looks at, who has certain skills, who shows up in the news, who shows up in the media, who gets written up, who gets interviewed, and then the web crawler sells those names to recruiters who then sell those names to you, as usually in the form of a recruitment or an employment agency or a headhunter or something like that. And then there are networking sites like LinkedIn where you put your resume out there and you can connect with people in that way. The next two slides are really fantastic, and again, I would highly recommend that you hold on to these, as you get into your career, because these are really important for you to consider all these factors and all these data. There's tons of resources out there for internal and external sources, so we need to know, are they worthwhile? How fast can these sources typically work to get us the applicants that we need? How expensive are they? And are they good candidates, or are they specialized candidates? Are they active seekers? Are they passive seekers, et cetera, et cetera? So here's a couple of handfuls that I think are important. Employee referrals, typically, as we know, are fast, right? Because you ask your employee to recommend somebody, and they can easily name people off the top of their head, and they recommend them. Depending on how you reward those referrals, it could be no cost or moderate cost, or low cost, really. I mean, you give them a couple $100 and thank them for, recommending people, right? And that helps you find active as well as passive job seekers. That's a good source. A career site has moderate speed because, again, you've got to get in, you've got to register, you've got to be able to search through their database. You have to advertise your job on there, and that takes time to develop. So it's not a fast process, but it's not grindingly slow either. And then the moderate cost, because it's not expensive like a headhunter would be, but it would still is a cost to get online, to have access to certain types of resumes. And then ultimately, would you get active or passive recruits? It probably gives you only active recruiters, because active recruits, because those are people who are advertising their resumes with the job site. So people are going to be searching and scanning their resumes because they're actively looking for jobs. Let me see if I can find an example here, one that is incredibly slow. Search firms are slow, and they're incredibly expensive. Because the search firms, you contract with the search firm, then they interview you and they help you come up with criteria. Then they go out and they actively look with those web bots, right? They get names of people, and then they turn around, they pre-screen those names, and then they send those names back to you. So that's going to be a longer process. You typically, if you're going to use a search firm, you use a search firm for higher level positions, particularly when you really want to get the full range of quality of candidates, not just active seekers, but passive seekers as well. And that gets you what you need there. Again, this is the same as in the previous slide. It's, again, more resources of external resources that you could use. Schools, for example, is a slow recruiting process because you're going to recruit people while they're in school, typically during their last semester of school. You bring them out, you interview them. They can't start until they graduate, right? Because oftentimes, a bachelor's degree at a minimum or a master's degree is required before you can hire them. I know for myself, as we hire people in academia, it takes us a year before, from the time we identify that we have a vacancy, we recruit people in the summer, we interview them in the fall, and then we end up offering them the job sometime either late fall or early spring, and they don't start till the following August. So it could be a year or more by the time you recognize you have a vacancy and by the time the cycle fills and you bring somebody on board later. So school recruiting is incredibly slow because you're typically waiting for people to achieve their degrees, whatever those degrees are, and there's going to be long delays for that. Walk-ins, of course, are very fast, they're low cost, but you're only going after active job seekers, not passive job seekers. So again, make sure you hold on to this list. Make sure you refer to this list. And as you're thinking about developing recruiting plans, be aware of those three criteria: the speed of resources, the cost of the resources, and whether or not you get active or passive or both recruits in that process.